So you have these inequalities of wealth that have been perpetuated over time. You can go back and easily talk about enslavement and people coming out of having been enslaved and not given anything, and literally at the mercy of white landowners, but sharecropping in the South. But if you look in the North, you have predatory lending rates, as we talked about over time. And one of the things that we talked about in particular in Justice Deferred Race and the Supreme Court was the issues of literally we have had 12 generations since we first had laws. First, it should be said, of course, that there is no such thing as race. Whether you take it as someone like myself, faith based, that God created all people in her or his image, or if you look at what geneticists say, scientists say about, there's no such thing as race, but the laws. The laws in America define race as a category, and then those laws over the years have been used to have differences between particularly black and white people in the United States.
Thank,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for that. I get the point that you say there, especially in the concluded part of it, that race actually does it exist as it were, no, at least not in the sense that a lot of people look at it like we actually naturally categorized into different groups. There is this pure race and the inferior race and all the whole gibberish that people say, you know. Um, if that is the situation, does it worry people that administer the society, or is it just in their favor? Because now we understand that it's actually a social construct, like we often say. Is it to their advantage that they have this confusion in the society, or is it because they have not been able to solve the problem of that we are referring to here, this discrimination, this deliberate abuse of the right of other people, and of course, we then look for ways to justify it, is racism or things like that. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think it's changed over time, but I think that is a key question that you have identified, and it's complex. And I think maybe one way to look at it is how critical race theory was developed by the great black scholar, legal uh, law professor at Harvard, Derek Bell. It was 1972. And Bell realized that despite Brown v. Board 1954 that overruled Plessy v. Ferguson 1896, it said separate but equal was not there. Integration had not worked. You hadn't had it. And historically, many of the black institutions themselves had been weakened. You had the brain drain from colleges at all black schools, of course, which had top professors, including himself, were hired away by a place like Harvard or Princeton or Yale and others. So when they came integrated, if you look at what had happened in society when in the South, which really doesn't start desegregating the schools until the 1970s, many years after, your high school coaches, for example, the white coach would be the coach, and the African American coach would be the assistant coach. You'd have the superintendent would be white when they integrated the schools, and then the black who had been superintendent would be the assistant superintendent. So perpetuating those things. So Bell was a controversial theorist. He, as I said, the first tenured African American professor at Harvard. He's often viewed as the primary founder of critical race theory. Um, and his views on integration, the possibility of racial progress, and racial reconciliation were cautiously negative. So, as late as 1992, Bell wrote, and I want to quote what he's saying here so I get it right. Black people will never gain full equality in this country. Even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. Now, he's perhaps best remembered for arguing, in fact, that the U.S. Supreme Court case in 1951 should have modified Plessy v. Ferguson's precedent rather than overturn it because he felt Brown merely weakened black institutions without providing for black educational quality.
This is actually a question of injustice rather than race, no? I remember that I did ask the question before sometime when we made it the first time. If a system is outrightly unjust to a certain section of the society, I find it purely disheartening, no? Because I look at it as an injustice rather than a race argument. So I just wanted to chip in that, yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. And I was surprised when we wrote this book, Justice Deferred Race in the Supreme Court, to see how we had set up a system in which African Americans were not only excluded, of course, they didn't have the vote because the Supreme Court had ruled that as long as you could use race neutral language, that African Americans could be disfranchised by picking out, as we talked about in the criminal justice system, things like an understanding clause or literacy clause and things like this to keep people from voting, the poll tax, all those sorts of things. But it's even the more recent times, if you think about it, Social Security, which came about with the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt. The Southern white congressmen were so powerful that they had excluded from the rules of Social Security, that was a fallback for people, farm workers and domestics, which were the jobs that African Americans were most employed in. So while whites were getting Social Security, while farmers were getting support, it did not go to their workers, all those things they were excluded from during the Depression. But then World War II was an extraordinary game changer when you think about the rights that were given to veterans, and these are black veterans who had fought as well, so that veterans could now get a mortgage to buy a home. So whites were able to buy homes which appreciated in value, that then allowed them to use that as collateral for their children to go to college, etc. They could also go to college and be paid for by the veterans after World War II. So why didn't that benefit black soldiers and veterans as well? Well, because you had redlining practices. You had covenants which said that black people cannot buy in areas which are those which appreciated, but only in other areas. So that was just another step of affirmative action for whites that keeps blacks disadvantaged. And of course, in the American South, the former Confederacy, black soldiers could not go to the University of South Carolina or Clemson University here in South Carolina, or the University of Alabama, or the University of Tennessee, or the University of Texas, or North Carolina, or any of those places. So they had to go to historically black colleges, which were great schools that had so much and did so much good for the black community, but they didn't have the resources, let alone the networks of the other places. So you have this continual perpetuation of ways in which whites gathered and accumulated wealth that excluded African Americans in the United States.
So in this sense, if we were to look at it now with just a bit of reasoning, we don't need to think so much to understand this. It means that the problem of discrimination in the United States, the problem of injustice that is perpetrated against a certain section of the society, and in this case we are looking at the African American, is a crime that is being committed by the state, the institution that are not that they are just encouraging it, but they are designing it and they are executing it. Can you say anything to that effort?
No, I think that's exactly right, but I think it's larger than that. And let me put it this way. Uh, Henry Adams, in one of the more celebrated books in America called The Education of Henry Adams, of the Adams family, of the presidents, the second president, and his son, another president, said that the American mind stood alone in history for the ignorance of the past. And I think that is a real problem, that people do not know this history. And that's part of what critical race theory approach to society is trying to help people to understand. In fact, it was the founding of that family, the second president, John Adams, had the answer. And he says, facts are stubborn things, and whatever our wishes, our inclination, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. So now, critical race theory, as it's being called, as people sort of started attacking it, says that you cannot even teach about race in American society, not just critical race theory, but race that might make people feel uncomfortable, one group of people or the others. It's a real crisis, not only in education, but democracy in America today. Critical race theory, as opposed to, is expanded to other disciplines, but as I said, approach to society, but it is being, has led to people saying they feel uncomfortable, and you cannot make children in school feel uncomfortable, so you cannot teach about race in schools. In several states have passed laws like Tennessee and South Carolina and others.